Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The executive director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to a Tuesday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Today is Tuesday. It is the 29th day of August in the year 2017. 2 more days, and then on Friday of this week, we will move into the month of September. And, of course, next Monday, as we mentioned yesterday, is Labor Day. And I think that really kind of brings the summer to an end. I really think, given what's happening in Houston, I think more than anything else, that's going to bring summer to an end this year, not Labor Day. Everybody, all of us are just absolutely stunned by the levels of rain. Rain. I mean, can you imagine? One of the places down there said something, like 43 inches of rain so far, with the possibility of 10 or more inches, between the rest of today and into tomorrow. I mean, it's just unbelievable. And we talked yesterday about the concrete and all of that, and there's no place for the water to go, and the fact that we didn't. Bob and I were chatting before we came on the air, and I was making reference to an article I read this morning, which was focusing principally on statements by leaders in the country that this really constitutes a 500-year flood, and what that really means. And a lot of people don't know what that means. A lot of people think it means that they're guaranteed that it's not going to happen again for another 500 years. Well, the implication, what the implication of the term is about, is that the chances are 1 in 500 that we'll have another happening like this. But the author of the article made the point that given what we should have been doing and didn't do or haven't done, and in fact, many of the things we did were exactly the wrong things, then the fact of the matter is 1 in 500 chances that we would have another one somewhere in that portion of the country are pretty long odds. Chances are we could have another one next year. And in the article it mentioned places like Tampa and Pensacola and New Orleans and a number of other places in that area. One of the things that is a tip-off, and I had mentioned yesterday that everything I've been reading talked about the extreme warmth of the water in the Gulf. I read an article this morning that makes the point that the surface temperature in the past year of the Gulf never got below 73 degrees. If you think about that, then that's just tailor-made to feed moisture into a hurricane. If you get a perfect storm like obviously this one is, imperfect, obviously we don't mean that in a positive sense. But, when you consider the amount of concrete and the lack of zoning in the Houston area and the fact that provision was not made for preventing something like this and what it's going to cost to keep it from happening again. And again, all of that is obviously dwarfed by continued opposition to the idea of climate changes being involved in this at all. And of course, the fact of the matter is, as far as the deniers are concerned, there's really no way to prove that climate change is in any part responsible for this. But the fact of the matter is, everybody who thinks knows that it is. But it's kind of like, and in fact, this was one of the arguments that was used in the article. I believe it was Eugene Robinson in the Washington Post, actually, that wrote this today. And his basic point is you can't really prove that alcohol contributes directly to automobile accidents either, because you can't prove in a particular case that it was the alcohol that was responsible for the accident or anything like that. In other words, you can't, in this kind of a situation, provide the kind of definitive evidence that's going to convince people that are looking for every out in the world to deny it. There's no way you can do that. So basically, we can't win this argument. One would think that the kind of devastation we're looking at in Houston would begin to change minds on climate change. But it's clearly not going to happen, because too many people have too much to gain by not acknowledging it. And consequently, they are putting all of the people in the path of something like this at risk. It's pretty frightening and pretty disturbing when you think about it, because what it says is that we have reached the point where we're unable to protect ourselves, that our political leaders are unable to make the kinds of decisions and the kinds of tough calls that they need to be able to make. And whether it's our political system, whether it's the pluralism that has overtaken our party systems, whatever it might be that is causing it, the fact of the matter is we are pretty much being held prisoner to our own inability to move off the base, as it were, home base. And it's pretty frightening. It's pretty devastating when one thinks of the things that could or might happen in the future. There's absolutely no question that, as we know, in the midst of all of this, that North Korea fired off another missile, and this one went right over the northern portion of Japan, and put Japan in a frenzied situation. And of course, we screamed and hollered and did all the other things. But the bottom line is, I think the boy prince of North Korea is very aware that we can scream and holler and complain and yell and go to the United Nations and do all of these things. But the bottom line is, there's only so much we can do. The reality is, we probably can't do anything. And of course, the fact of the matter is that we've got a person in power who would be inclined to do something. And that something would be exactly the wrong thing to do. So under the present circumstances, maybe not doing anything is the best we can hope for. But anyway, with that kind of an introduction, welcome to our program on a Tuesday, at the end of the month of August in the year 2017. I have to acknowledge, before we get into today's program, that I am so excited about today's program, and I'll tell you in a minute when we get into it as to why. But the one thing I thought about 5 minutes before I got ready to go on the air and connected with Bob on Skype and got the program, and asked him to get the program ready to go. I was kind of thinking to myself as I was getting ready to go on the air. And I thought, boy, I just hope I can hang in there long enough to get to share some of this stuff. It is so exciting. I've been doing a lot of research, and most of it, for obvious reasons, is because of the virtual center, because of the obligations to come on a regular basis on the air and do whatever I can do to share a degree of enthusiasm about the period and what we can learn from the period that is so invaluable, I think, and that overwhelms some of the material, some of the information that we've been given over the years and led to believe. This stuff is so interesting and so challenging, and there's so much involved in it. In fact, I made a comment. I was talking a little bit about some of the things that will be on today's program. And my wife made the comment earlier, and she said, "Are you opposed to the Constitution?" And I said, "No, I'm not. Of course I'm not opposed to the Constitution. But what I am is amazed and excited because for the first time in my life, I'm beginning to appreciate what those people who wrote it and got it ratified had to do to be successful. I mean, it's a classic example of the ends justifying the means. These people believed that the situation was so drastic, so dire, that they were justified in doing whatever they needed to do in order to provide a fix. And they did it. And the way they did it, and some of the specific examples of challenges they faced, and the way they were able to get around them or work their way through them, is amazing. I don't think it at all demeans the founders. If it does anything else, it causes one to pause and have a level of respect for them and for what they believed that they were doing, which is incredible. I don't believe that they are gods. I don't believe that all of their objectives were positive. I do believe, I'm aware, I'm not that naive, to know that many of these people had positive things to gain from many of these things. I understand that. But the fact of the matter is, when you weigh the alternatives and weigh the options, whether in fact you agree with them or not and the assumptions that motivated them, what they did was amazing. And the way they were able to pull it off is even more amazing. I just think it's exciting, and I hope that you'll agree with me at the end of today's program that some of this stuff is really, I just hope that I can do justice to it, because a lot of it is information and material that I've just recently gone over. There's so much, and it's all available now, and it wasn't available before. I mean, before all of these letters and documents were transcribed and available on, digitally on the internet, it was necessary to go to local historical societies, get your hands on original letter collections, and actually struggle with the handwriting of some of these people and abbreviations and the use of a form of language that's a little bit unfamiliar to us. And it took so long, and it was so laborious to go through much of this stuff. And it seems to me you just have to credit the people who have been writing the history for so long, because of what they had to go through in order to do it and bring it to us. Now it's all there. And there's so much of it that it really does challenge one to go through it. I mean, for example, I've been spending years on much of these things, probably 40, 50 years off and on, looking at some of the research involved in this, because it's always interested me. It's what I got my degree in, what I chose to do my research in, etc. But the fact of the matter is, there's so much I didn't consult that I'm now consulting. All of it because of this program and because of the opportunity to share some of these things with the listening audience here at the Head On Radio Network, and the audience that we've been able to develop over the years for in response to the virtual center. And it's motivating me. I just hope I'm up to it, and I'm doing my best, and I hope that you'll appreciate what we've come up with. I think it's pretty exciting. Let me go through the details that we usually go through at the beginning of every program. We have a phone number, and the purpose of it is to give you an opportunity to come on the air and share your thoughts with us on some of the things we're talking about. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. If you'd like to communicate one-on-one with me in an email, I would love to hear from you that way. If you want to get your ideas down and send them to me in an email, I'll be glad to get them on the air for you. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, OBRIEN, 906@gmail.com. And again, I remind you of our Facebook page and some of the postings that are on our Facebook page. I haven't as yet included some of the material that we looked at yesterday and we will continue to look at today. I haven't really put it on Facebook yet, on our Facebook pages yet, in part because I'm not through collecting it, if that makes sense. It's a treasure trove, at least from my perspective, and I'm struggling to go through it, especially at a rate that it permits me to come on the air day after day and share some of it with you. So I really haven't had a chance to sit down and pull it all together and put it on Facebook so that everybody can appreciate it. But I plan to do that in the next few days. And I ask you to bear with me. But again, there are a number of, I think, very informative postings on our Facebook page. The most recent one I put on there yesterday is John Winthrop's City Upon a Hill speech delivered in 1630. Which is targeted to the history class that I'm teaching at West Virginia Tech. I have that class first thing tomorrow morning, second class this week. And I plan to go over this document with the class tomorrow morning. But it's on there, and I invite you to look at it if you haven't looked at it before. We have indeed covered it here on the Virtual Center. We've done a portion of a program on it. I remember very well that we did do that. And some of the questions that I've included in the second page of the posting, I think are pretty valuable because they give some insights, some avenues, some ways to get into that document by raising some questions about it that become entrees into the mind that created it. In this case, John Winthrop of Massachusetts, 17th century Massachusetts. In yesterday's program, for those of you who were with us, you'll know that we were spending quite a bit of time on the issue of ratification of the Constitution. And because of something I've been writing, and I must admit that my writing has been pretty much on hold now for 3 or 4 days because of the research that I'm doing. But we've been spending a lot of our time with ratification in the state of New York. And part of the reason for that is, for those who haven't been with us, this is a little bit of background. Because in the course of my writing, about these issues and about the issues of ratification, I've come across the New York ratification struggle as being extremely significant. And I'm learning an awful lot from it. And it's an area that I really hadn't done the kind of digging into that I've been doing of late. Part of the reason is because I've become fascinated with one Robert Lansing. Robert Lansing was a judge on the state Supreme Court in New York. He was one of 3 delegates elected to represent New York at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. The other 2 New York representatives or delegates were Alexander Hamilton, which, a name that most of us know, and John Lansing, a name that many of us may not know. John Lansing at the time was mayor of Albany, New York. John Lansing was also substantially younger than Robert Yates. In fact, Lansing had clerked for Judge Yates earlier. He was in his 30s. Yates was quite a bit older than that. These were the 3 delegates to the Constitutional Convention from New York. Yates and Lansing were both opposed to the Constitution of the United States. They were elected as anti-federalists. In other words, they were elected to vote against ratifying the Constitution of the United States and doing whatever they felt necessary to revise the Articles of Confederation in a way that was sufficient to preserve the Union. In other words, they were elected to do exactly what the call to the election stated they were being elected to do. Participate in deliberations with delegates from other states to revise the Articles of Confederation in order to make them workable, acknowledging that there were weaknesses in the Articles which had to be fixed. And the fact of the matter is they ran into a buzzsaw in the person of James Madison, because Madison was so opposed to the Articles of Confederation and so convinced that the Articles were beyond the ability to reform, and that the only answer was to replace them with something totally different, that led him to draft what we know as the Virginia Plan, a series of resolutions outlining a totally new structure of national government. And I hadn't mentioned this particular thing before, but the fact of the matter is the Virginia Plan constituted a series of 19 resolutions. And in fact, in one of the reports on the convention after it was over, and this was specifically in the report of one Luther Martin, who was a Baltimore attorney who had been sent to Philadelphia to represent the state of Maryland at the Constitutional Convention, and he also was an opponent of the Constitution. And like Lansing and Yates, left the Constitution before it was over because he was so disenchanted with what was happening there and what those that were really driving the convention were really trying to do. After the Constitution was ratified, approved by the convention, and the decision was made to send it out to the states for ratification, the legislature of Maryland, the Speaker of the House of Delegates, whose name was Thomas Cockey Dye, D-E-Y-E, rather minor name in this period, but I thought some of you might like to know it's Thomas Cockey Dye. He was the Speaker of the House of Delegates in Maryland. And after the Constitution arrived for ratification, then the various states took up the challenge of holding elections for conventions in their states to ratify the Constitution. This was the mode of ratification chosen by the Constitutional Convention. Special conventions in each state to ratify the Constitution. And so when the Constitution arrived for deliberation and ultimately the test of ratification, the Speaker of the House of Delegates in Maryland, Thomas Dye, issued a call to Maryland's delegates, those who had attended the convention from Maryland, and asked each of them to come before the House of Delegates and make a report on the convention as it had transpired. And in January, I believe it was the 21st of January, Luther Martin showed up with his report. And he entitled his report, "The Genuine Information." In other words, what he was saying in his title is that this document is the straight poop. This is what happened. And this is why I was so disenchanted, I left. Martin says at the beginning of his document, which was extremely long, his report is extremely lengthy. Let me give you an idea of just how lengthy it is. After he delivers his report to the House of Delegates, he then publishes it in the Maryland newspapers. It appears in 12 consecutive editions of the newspaper. In other words, there are 12 segments to Luther Martin's Genuine Information. It's that long. It is so thorough and so well written and so well argued that anti-federalists throughout the other states jumped on it and began to have it printed in their papers. The result is that Luther Martin's Genuine Information appeared in newspapers throughout all the states, including New York. I wrote my dissertation on Maryland's ratification. That means that I was into Luther Martin's Genuine Information document in the 1970s, 40 some odd years ago, when I was writing my dissertation. But I didn't read the same way then. I guess I didn't quite grasp the full implications of what I was reading at that point. And while there are extensive citations in my dissertation on Luther Martin's presentation to the Maryland legislature, the fact of the matter is there's so much there that I missed that it's almost embarrassing. But at the same time, it's exciting, if that makes sense for me. This morning, I was telling Bob Kincaid, before you went on the air, is the first time that I actually sat there and read the entire presentation. It took me about 2.5 hours to read it. The fact that it took 12 consecutive editions of the newspaper to reproduce it for the general public indicates how substantive it is. In my dissertation, I had mentioned how well written and how substantively quality it is. It's really hard to refute much of what Luther Martin says because his grasp of the issues is strong. Luther Martin knows what the hell he's talking about. He knows the law. He is an attorney. He was, in fact, Attorney General for the state of Maryland. He knows the law. He knows the tricks used by attorneys with the law. He was able to see through much of the defenses of the Constitution. He was able to understand the strategies and tactics that Federalists were using at the Constitutional Convention. Consequently, his presentation, his genuine information, is exactly what he says it is. It's genuine information. What I recall in my research and what I've written in my dissertation is the fact that even when I first read it, which was 40 some odd years ago, I was able to appreciate how well done and how solid Luther Martin's arguments were. And I was able to appreciate the fact that it would be very difficult to refute his arguments because they were so solid. He was right on. He knew exactly what Madison, Hamilton, and the rest of them were doing and the strategies they were using to do it. And he included it in this document. This document is explosive. So the fact of the matter is, why don't more people know about it? Why don't more people know what's in it? Why don't more people read it? Why wasn't Luther Martin's genuine information given more credit and credibility than it has been given? What happened? In my dissertation, I made the point, and I'm more than convinced now that I was right. There was no way for the Federalists to take on Luther Martin and the quality of the document. Some people tried. In reading the minutes of the ratifying convention in Maryland, one of the legal minds that supported the Constitution in Maryland was named Judge Hanson. He was a judge. He understood the Constitution. He understood Luther Martin's criticism of the Constitution. He also was well aware that you could take issue with Luther Martin and you could disagree with Luther Martin, but you really couldn't prove that he was wrong, because more often than not, he wasn't. The only way to challenge Luther Martin's genuine information was to criticize the man who wrote it, was to so demean and so besmirch his reputation that people would dismiss what he was writing and what he was saying. And that's what they did. Luther Martin was a heavy drinker. It was well known. His opponents, Federalists in Maryland, set out to destroy Luther Martin's reputation, to destroy his credibility, to label him an irrecoverable alcoholic who was functioning in a world that most of us couldn't understand, and that he was given to fits of anger and fits of fanaticism, and that oftentimes even he wasn't aware of what he was saying and what he was writing. And the fact of the matter is, it worked. Luther Martin's reputation was damaged to the degree that I believe it damaged people's respect or willingness to seriously consider what he was saying. The Constitution sailed through the Maryland Ratifying Convention so easily. There were only 12 votes against it and 30 some odd for it, as I recall. I can't remember the exact number of positives. I think it was, anyway, there were only 12 opponents, 12 no votes in the convention. But anti-federalists throughout the country were very well aware of the quality of what Luther Martin is saying, and his genuine information was published and republished in a number of other places. And one of them was in New York. And much of Luther Martin's argument is picked up by some of the prominent leaders of anti-federalism in New York. Among them, John Lansing, Robert Yates, Melancton Smith, Governor George Clinton, some of the most prominent Americans who lived in New York and who were opposed to the Constitution. The two most prominent supporters of the Constitution in New York were Alexander Hamilton and John Jay. And you'll recall that John Jay wrote a number of early Federalist papers. The first Federalist paper, number 1, was written by Hamilton because the series was his. It was his idea. It was his baby. But John Jay wrote numbers 2, 3, 4, and 5. And then he became ill. He only wrote one more Federalist paper. It was number 64. So John Jay only wrote 5 of the 85 Federalist Papers. 2 through 5 and 64. And John Jay's contribution to the Federalist argument for ratification of the Constitution was the need to bind the nation together under one government and to emphasize the advantages of unity and the disadvantages of division and the dangers that the nation would experience if it fell for the argument of leading anti-federalists that in order for Republican government to work, the most logical thing to do would be to divide the Union into regions, to group states in regional groupings that better reflected the commonalities in that region that they had in common as opposed to the other regions. The arguments were that the Union would be better served, that republicanism would be better served, that the citizens of America would be better served if instead of having one government over all 13 colonies, we had 3 separate regions, and each of them had their own government. And then these 3 governments would enter into a confederation similar to the Articles of Confederation. They would unify in the areas where unity was important, but they would remain independent in areas where the region was unique. That was a prominent strategy of anti-federalists at the beginning to defeat the Constitution. Consequently, it's the major theme of the first numbers of the Federalist papers, and those 4 Federalist papers were written by John Jay. So the general conclusion is that when one looks at the entire 85 Federalist papers and looks at the quality of papers that Madison wrote, like numbers 10, number 39, number 51, some of the more prominent, Madison probably wrote 13 or 14 of them. Hamilton then wrote all the rest. Then it's usually concluded that John Jay's contribution to ratification of the Constitution was rather minimal compared to the contributions of James Madison and Alexander Hamilton. And from the perspective of the Federalist Papers, that's true. Why am I saying this? Because when you read the minutes and the papers associated with New York's ratification of the Constitution, you begin to appreciate that John Jay is probably more responsible than anybody for New York's ratification of the Constitution. Remember, and I mentioned this yesterday, when the election for delegates to the New York Ratifying Convention were counted, anti-federalists outnumbered supporters of the Constitution 46-19. They had better than a 2-to-1 majority. The people of New York elected delegates to the convention fully confident that the convention would vote down the Constitution of the United States. And yet, at the very end, New York ratifies. And there are a lot of factors involved in that ratification, but one is struck by the role that John Jay played in turning a very small minority of delegates into a winning vote for the Constitution of the United States in New York. Most people assume that the leadership of support for the Constitution in New York was taken by Alexander Hamilton. And indeed, in terms of the amount of time he spoke, the amount of speeches he delivered, and the length of those speeches, the show indeed was Hamilton's. But the fact of the matter is, a lot of Federalists in New York were critical of Hamilton because the Federalist Papers were being written and Hamilton was standing in the convention and literally giving the delegates what was in the newspapers in the Federalist Papers. In other words, he wasn't having the impact that he wanted. John Jay was the one, it seems to me, who had the greatest impact. When the Federalist Papers came out and started to be published in October of '87, by the time you got to the spring of '88, a substantial number of the Federalist Papers had already appeared in the New York newspapers. But the fact of the matter is they weren't having the impact that the authors of the Federalist Papers wanted them to have. One member of the Federalist member of the New York Ratifying Convention, named William North, made the point in February that the Federalist Papers were too intellectual. They weren't being read by or discussed by or understood by the people of New York. They were going over the heads of the majority of citizens, and that this was a failing of the Federalist Papers. Throughout the months and years that we've been together here at the Virtual Center, one of the points I've tried to make is that the Federalist Papers were intentionally designed to be over the heads of the majority of the people, because if the people really understood what they were saying, not only would they not have been persuaded by the Federalist Papers, they would have been persuaded to stand up strongly against ratification of the Constitution. If the people had really understood what they were being asked to vote for, they never would have supported the Constitution of the United States. That is effectively what Otto, in his secret report to Vergennes in France, writes to Vergennes in October of '88. The Constitution of the United States, he says, only passed because it was filled with qualifications, evasions, circumlocutions, and innuendos designed to confuse the average reader, but at the same time designed to appeal directly to those people who really understood what was going on. In a sense, what Otto was reporting to Vergennes is that from his perspective in New York City, the reason the Constitution was ratified, the reason the Constitutional Convention was even called, was because the calling of it, which was the document that came out of the Annapolis Convention in the fall of '86 and was drafted principally by Alexander Hamilton, was written in such a way that the people really didn't understand what they were being asked to vote for. And they went along with calling a convention and electing delegates to a convention to ratify a constitution that they really didn't understand. And so the irony is that William North's criticism of the Federalist Papers is really testimony to how successful the Federalist Papers were. I think that's an incredible piece of information. But let's go on. As I mentioned this morning, I not only read Luther Martin's Genuine Information, but early in this period, I read a 19-page pamphlet written by John Jay. I have to say that this pamphlet was one of the most brilliant pieces of persuasive writing that I've ever read. Not only that, but the reaction to John Jay's 19-page pamphlet was exactly why he wrote it. Anti-Federalists, opponents of the Constitution in New York, were admitting to each other and admitting in public that John Jay's pamphlet was having such an impact on citizens of New York that large numbers of people who were at first opposed to the Constitution were being persuaded to go for it as a result of John Jay's document, John Jay's pamphlet. Consequently, John Jay's pamphlet was picked up and spread throughout the states. It was written in New York City. It was aimed principally at the people in and around New York. But it was quickly spread throughout the state because it was having such a positive impact on persuading the uncertain to go for the Constitution of the United States and give it a chance. Let me share with you, if I can, the reasons that John Jay's pamphlet was so successful, whereas the Federalist Papers were not. In New York, John Jay was able to do what the Federalist Papers couldn't do, which was to persuade a significant number of people in New York and to persuade members of the delegation who had been elected to vote against the Constitution to vote for it. He was persuading people who ran on one ticket to change horses in midstream and vote for a document that they had been elected to vote down. How did he do it? One of the things he says very early in his pamphlet, after he goes through the circumstances which led to the Constitutional Convention in the first place, and recounted some of the problems that the Articles of Confederation were having that prompted the need for a change. John Jay said, "The question now before us," he wrote this pamphlet was published in late April, the 27th of April, 1788. He said, "The question now before us naturally leads to three questions, three inquiries. One, whether it is probable that a better plan can be obtained. Two, whether, if attainable, it's likely to be done. And three, what would be our situation if, after rejecting this Constitution, all our efforts to obtain a better one should prove fruitless?" The strategy. What John Jay is saying in this pamphlet to the citizens of New York is A, nothing's perfect. All of us will admit that these are human beings who were at Philadelphia. They did the best they could. But even they admit that it's not perfect. But the reality is that they met all summer. They did the best they could. They agreed as much as they could agree. And they gave us a document which was the best they could come up with. His argument is, can we afford to run the risk of defeating it on the mistaken assumption that we can convene another convention, which what many of the anti-federalists in New York were talking about. We can convene another convention and do better. John Jay is saying that's too risky. The Constitution, as it's being presented to us, has a provision in it for amendments. The best thing we can do is give it a try and be prepared to amend it in areas where it needs fixing. But we'll never know where its strengths are as well as where its weaknesses are unless we put it into operation. We can't risk anything else. And then he points out that our politics is divided into two parties which have become so rigid in their positions that to assume that we can call another convention and that these people could come together and cooperate even more than the delegates at Philadelphia were able to cooperate is a dream. It's a figment of our imagination. We can't risk that, Jay says. Here's a quote from his document. They tell us very honestly that this plan, the Constitution, is the result of accommodation. They do not hold it up as the best of all possible ones, but only as the best which they could unite in and agree to. If such men, appointed and meeting under such auspicious circumstances, and so sincerely disposed to conciliation, could go no further in their endeavors to please every state and every body, what reason have we at present to expect any system that would give more general satisfaction than this? That's pretty damn powerful, if you think about it. He goes on, suppose this plan to be rejected. What measures would you propose for obtaining a better one? Some will answer, let's appoint another convention. And as everything has been said and written that can well be said and written on the subject, they will be better informed than the former one was, and consequently be better able to make and agree upon a more eligible document. To that, John Jay answers as follows. As vice does not sow the seeds of virtue, so neither does passion cultivates the fruit of reason. Suspicions and resentments create no disposition, suspicions and resentments create no disposition to conciliate, nor do they infuse a desire of making partial and personal objects bend to general union and the common good. The utmost efforts of that excellent disposition were necessary to enable the late convention to perform their task. And although contrary causes sometimes operate similar effects, yet to expect that discourse and animosity would produce the fruits of confidence and agreement is to expect grapes from thorns and figs from thistles. In other words, if we think a second convention is going to do better than the first one, we're dreaming, John Jay says. Let those who are sanguine in their expectations of a better plan from a new convention also reflect on the delays and risk to which it would expose us. Let them consider whether we ought, by continuing much longer in our present humiliated condition, to give other nations further time to perfect their restrictive systems of commerce, to reconcile their own people to them, and to fence and guard and strengthen them by all those regulations and contrivances in which a jealous policy is ever fruitful. Let them consider whether we ought to give further opportunities to discord, to alienate the hearts of our citizens from one another, and thereby encourage new Cromwells to bold exploits. We would be taking a risk and giving opportunity to our rivals, to our potential enemies, that would put us in serious danger if we risk not approving this Constitution of the United States. This document, from my perspective, is brilliant. And what makes it brilliant is that it makes sense. It's understandable. It's something that people who read it can understand. It doesn't surprise me that it was successful in persuading a number of people to give the Constitution a shot. Many of these people, after they had already elected delegates and given these delegates instructions to vote against the Constitution. And then later in his document, John Jay includes the following paragraph. I made a note in my notes and said this paragraph may be the most persuasive argument for ratification I have ever read. That's me talking to myself. Here's the paragraph. These are short hints. They ought not to be more developed. You can easily, in your own mind, dilate and trace them through all their relative circumstances and connections. Pause for a moment and reflect whether the matters you are disputing about are of sufficient moment to justify your running such extravagant risks. Reflect that the present plan comes recommended to you by men and fellow citizens who have given you the highest proofs that men can give of their justice, their love for liberty, and their country, of their prudence, of their application, and of their talents. They tell you it's the best they could form, and that in their opinion it's necessary to redeem you from those calamities which already begin to be heavy upon us all. You find that not only those men, but others of similar character, of whom you have also had very ample experience, advise you to adopt it as well. You find that entire states concur in the sentiment, and among them are your next door neighbors, both whom have shed much blood in the cause of liberty, and have manifested as strong and constant a predilection for a free Republican government as any state in the Union, perhaps in the world. They perceive not those latent mischiefs in it with which some double-sided politicians endeavor to alarm you. You cannot but be sensible that this plan or constitution will always be in the hands and power of the people, and that if on experiment it should be found defective or incompetent, they may either remedy its defects or substitute another in its place. The objectionable parts of it are certainly very questionable, for otherwise there would not be such a variety of opinions about them. Experience will better determine such questions than theoretical arguments. And so far as the danger of abuses is urged against the institution of a government, remember that a power to do good always involves also a power to do harm. We must, in the business of government as well as in all other business, have some degree of confidence, as well as a great degree of caution. Who on a sickbed would refuse medicines from a physician merely because that physician has as much power to administer deadly poisons as salutary remedies? It's well thought out, it's well reasoned, it's well written. It's persuasive. It's able to do exactly why it was written, and it worked. I think John Jay probably ought to get as much credit for ratification in New York as anybody else, except maybe Robert Yates. Robert Yates was an anti-federalist delegate from New York at the Constitutional Convention, along with John Lansing, the other anti-federalist delegate. He walked out of the convention on July 10th in disgust. And he immediately went back to New York and began to pull together arguments against the handiwork of the convention even before the convention adjourned. And beginning in late 1787, under the heading Brutus, Robert Yates published 16 separate articles criticizing various aspects of the Constitution of the United States that was being drafted in Philadelphia. His purpose in the Brutus letters was to elect anti-federalists to the New York ratifying convention, so that the convention would be dominated by opponents of the Constitution. He was successful because anti-federalists were elected 46 to 19 federalists. When the the ratifying convention in New York met, Robert Yates was there along with Lansing. But one of the most interesting aspects of the convention is that Robert Yates rarely spoke. He didn't say much. He was appointed to chair a couple of committees in order to bring disagreeing people together. But most of the anti-federalist speeches were delivered by Melancton Smith, and later in the convention by John Lansing. It's very significant to me that toward the end of the convention, after New Hampshire ratifies the Constitution to become the 9th state, which effectively makes the Constitution the law of the land. But that still leaves Virginia and New York outside the Union. But when Virginia ratifies in late June as the 10th state, the pressure is really on New York to ratify. And many people begin to make the point, which is very obvious. Now that we know the Constitution is going into effect, can we here in New York risk not being in the Union? We're liable to get shafted in so many ways. At that point, Melancton Smith switches sides and stops speaking against the Constitution and begins to take up support of the Constitution. That's when leadership of the opposition to the Constitution shifts to John Lansing. And toward the end of the convention, John Lansing is making most of the major speeches against the Constitution, no longer having Melancton Smith on his side. Given the number of speeches he delivered and the number of articles he'd written in newspapers, historians are still confused by Melancton Smith and his turn at the last minute. The fact of the matter is, John Lansing reputedly was not a very powerful speaker. He was mayor of Albany, but the general, the general understanding at the times was that he wasn't that powerful a speaker. In fact, he was at the Constitutional Convention, and William Pierce of Georgia, who put together a character sketch of all the delegates, all 55 delegates there, made the point that Lansing was not a very effective speaker. He had a hitch in his delivery that made it very difficult to follow him, Pierce said. And it was very, very hard to really tie in to what John Lansing was saying. But toward the end of the convention, Lansing assumes the leadership of the Anti-Federalists at the convention because apparently there's nobody else. And at the end of the convention, New York ratifies, but they propose a whole flood of amendments. I believe 35. And they focus the debate principally on conditional ratification. What they try to make the case on is, can we lay out certain amendments and say New York will ratify on the condition that these amendments are added to the Constitution? Many of the legal scholars in the group make the point that you can't do that you can't conditionally ratify. Finally, at the very end of the convention, the decision is made to ratify with a number of amendments proposed for addition to the Constitution. But this is the key to New York ratification. Simultaneously with a vote to ratify, New York also drafts a circular letter to all the states calling for a second convention. And onto that call, the governor himself, George Clinton, signs on. In other words, out of the New York Convention comes the vote to ratify with recommended amendments, plus a circular letter calling for a new constitutional convention to consider amendments, specifically a Bill of Rights. So when the first Congress meets, Madison has already given in on the need for a Bill of Rights. That's the only way he could get the Virginia Convention to ratify. So when the new Congress meets, Madison begins to push hard for the Bill of Rights. And staring him in the face is New York's circular letter calling for a new convention. And Madison's position in Congress is, we better deliver on a Bill of Rights, because if we don't, we're going to be back in convention. And if we go back in convention, everything we've won will be lost. I think one of the things that I appreciate, and I'm guessing one of the things that you probably appreciate as well now, is how close we came to not ratifying the Constitution of the United States. Anti-Federalists were in the majority in Virginia. They had a huge majority in New York. If those two states hadn't come on board, even though there were 9 states to ratify, which met the terms of ratification, likely the Union wouldn't have made it, not without Virginia and without New York. So that leaves the question of Robert Yates. Why didn't Robert Yates release his notes from the convention? He had proof of some of the things that Federalist supporters of the Constitution were saying in secret that I believe would have sunk the Constitution. And yet he wouldn't do it. As we mentioned at the end of the program yesterday, during one of his speeches, Alexander Hamilton was making this strong argument in favor of the importance of the states. Actually, I have the argument, I believe. Maybe I didn't make a copy of it. Hamilton made this impassioned plea for the value of the states and how important the states would be, and how he didn't really believe that this argument of leading anti-federalists, that the Constitution would make the states unnecessary, and that and finally we would end up with a monarchy. He didn't believe that was true. He believed the states would play an important role in the political system. At that point, Lansing got on his feet and basically called Alexander Hamilton a hypocrite. And Lansing pointed out that in the convention in Philadelphia, Hamilton had said exactly the opposite. Hamilton had supported the virtual annihilation of the states. Hamilton had said in his speech, his long 5-hour speech, that only a monarchy would work in this country. And now he's making this impassioned plea for the states and suggesting that he's not at all in favor of monarchy. Lansing called Hamilton a hypocrite. And as we saw yesterday from Pauline Meyer's book, Hamilton got furious because John Lansing was pulling information from Philadelphia in violation of the commitment of secrecy, the oath of secrecy that all the delegates had taken. Lansing was revealing to the New York delegates what Hamilton had said in Philadelphia in secret. And Hamilton was furious about it. And at that point, John Lansing made the argument to Robert Yates that he publish his notes, publish his minutes of the Philadelphia Convention, which would reveal what some of these guys said and would show many of them to be hypocrites. And Yates wouldn't do it. He was writing articles in the newspaper, first under Brutus, then after the ratifying convention started to meet, he wrote a couple of letters in June under the heading Sydney. And in it, he urged the convention to vote down the Constitution. And he compared, in one of his Sydney letters, he compared the Constitution with New York State Constitution in order to make the point that if the Constitution is ratified, New York's Constitution is gone, is done. But he would not release those minutes. And I think because of that, a convention which had a 46-19 majority in favor of voting against the Constitution of the United States voted to ratify it. I think, and I don't have any basis on knowing anything else, I think that Yates's position as a judge on the Supreme Court, probably meant that as a jurist, as a legalist, he would make legal arguments in articles, but he would not violate an oath. I believe his commitment to his principles as judge probably won the day. Probably got the Constitution ratified in New York. And likely made it possible that because New York did ratify, the Constitution of the United States itself could make it. I believe that. I mentioned at the beginning of the program today that I had found out some things in the course of my research that I found astounding. We've got less than 10 minutes to go on our program today. Let me share one of these with you. It's from Luther Martin's Genuine Information. It's so long and so detailed that it consumed 12 newspapers. It took 12 editions of the newspaper to get this entire speech published. It was too long and too detailed, I believe. I don't think the voters, the people of Maryland, could handle it. I don't believe that people were willing to sit down and read anything this extensive and this deep. And that, in combination with the attacks on Luther Martin's character and the assertions on the part of leading Maryland Federalists that there's no need to seriously read Luther Martin anyway, because as a raving drunk, he doesn't know what he's talking about half the time anyway. I think it worked. But let me share with you what Luther Martin says toward the end of his Genuine Information. During the convention, Luther Martin said, a number of anti-federalists were proposing the possibility of another convention, of trying to get the people to approve another convention and the election of new delegates to come up with a better plan than the Constitution that was being designed in Philadelphia. And Luther Martin said in his Genuine Information that in response to that, the Federalists responded in the secrecy of the Philadelphia Convention that there would never be another convention, that there was no chance in the world that opponents to this Constitution would ever have the chance to get a better one in a second convention. Luther Martin says, the threat that they used against us was, it's this or nothing, because you'll never get another convention. And then Luther Martin explained why. And here's the quote from Luther Martin. In fine, sir, Luther Martin said, all these threats were treated with contempt, and they were told that we apprehended but one reason to prevent the state's meeting again in convention, that when they discovered the part this convention had acted and how much its members were abusing the trust reposed in them by the people, the states would never again trust another convention, unquote. What Luther Martin is reporting in his Genuine Information is that the reason Federalists gave Anti-Federalists as to why they were blowing smoke trying to get a second convention is because once the people of America find out what we did in violation of their sending us to Philadelphia to revise the articles, and instead we scrapped them and drafted a totally new government. Once the people find that out, Federalists argued, the people will never again trust delegates to come into another convention. In other words, you better take this one because the people are never going to give you the chance at another one. I think that's unbelievable. I think that's incredible. It was being published in the papers all over America. But very few people picked it up. The document's so long and so well constructed that people didn't or wouldn't read it. But let me mention something else with just 2 minutes to go on our program today. In August, late August of 2017, as we're doing this program, we are very few states away from meeting the Article 5 provisions for the calling of an Article 5 convention to amend the Constitution of the United States. Let me take that and put it in the context of Luther Martin's statement from 1788. The people of the United States will never again trust delegates to come together in a convention because of what we did to them this time. And here we are, 4 or 5 states short of seeing exactly that happen. Apparently, the people have decided that they're willing to allow another constitutional convention. Apparently, the people in 2017 have decided that Luther Martin didn't know what he was talking about. Either that, or today, or the people of the United States today are being fed the biggest line in the history of American politics. That this call for a convention is really about a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution. The first convention that was held was called to revise the Articles. And the convention immediately became a runaway convention. The Articles were scrapped, and the Constitution of the United States was drafted and ultimately ratified. Now we're on the cusp of a second constitutional convention, theoretically for purposes of adopting a balanced budget amendment. But there's nothing in the Constitution to prevent these delegates, once they get together, from making the decision that this Constitution needs more changing than just a balanced budget amendment, and the entire Constitution, including the Bill of Rights, would be on the table for revision. And a lot of this would be driven by a mentality and by the kind of money provided by individuals and groups like the Koch brothers, and a short-sighted, narrow, bigoted mentality that has put the nation into the situation it's in today, with a president who followed up the bigotry of his arguments in Charlottesville with a blatant decision on a Friday night at the beginning of a huge hurricane, when he knew and admitted that the reason he did it then was because he would have maximum TV audience on Friday night because so many people were concerned about the hurricane. That's when the president decided to pardon Sheriff Arpaio of Arizona. To me, the pardon of Arpaio is an exclamation point to the bigotry that the president revealed in Charlottesville. I don't want that mentality debating changes to the Constitution of the United States. I think we've gone right to the end of our program. We are right at the top of the hour. I want to thank you for tuning in today to the Virtual Center. Thank you for your continued support of the Head On Radio Network. I invite you to tune in tomorrow, once again, at our regular time. For Bob Kincaid, Agnes, and the folks at Head On, this is Bill O'Brien thanking you for tuning in today, inviting you back tomorrow. Please have a wonderful evening. Be kind to each other, and thank you.